Hello, class. This is Professor Michael Bailey from BAAS 3020, and I wanted to give you an overview of the survey project assignment A2. This is really important because this is when we're going to really dive down and start focusing on what we want to research in. And this is an iterative process. We're going to start with broad ideas, brainstorming, and then get to some operational hypotheses that we're going to use throughout the rest of the survey project. So this is a very important step, and you need to do this as a team. You need to schedule an hour or 2 hour, I would suggest building in 2 hours, and if you get done quicker, Zoom meeting or in-person meeting to go through this as a team and to put it all together. Okay, this is not something you should be doing individually and then putting together. This really should be stepped through as a team. So basically, assignment A2, you're going to do 5 different steps or questions. You're first going to select the topics of research, and then you're going to dig down a little bit to define them more specific into dimensions of those topics. You're going to then select one out of the 3 topics that you came up with and identify related independent variables. Remember, these independent variables are classifications and groups that relate to the respondents to the survey. For example, their age, race, education, etc. And remember that your classmates are the ones who are going to be completing the survey, so you need to pick independent variables that your class will fall into. So for example, maybe you're interested in whether people who do not graduate high school affect some area. Well, you can't do that in this project because everyone who will be taking the survey is in college, and so you will have no data to analyze. So that's why it's really important that you focus on independent variables that your class can be representative of. Then you're going to use the dimensions that you came up with in step 1 to create a conceptual hypothesis relating the independent variables to the dimensions. Then you're going to define very specifically indicators for each independent variable that you're using. And this just breaks them down into groups like age ranges. So if age is your independent variable, then your indicators are like 0 to 10, 10 to, or 11 to 20, etc. Remember from your reading this week, these must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive so that, for example, again, in age, anyone answering the survey has a possibility. And then you're going to create the operational hypothesis using the indicators and the dimensions. Okay, these need to be very specific. If you have a vague hypothesis, it's going to be very difficult to do any kind of real analysis. And so what you're first learning here is that creating a survey is not as easy as it thinks, and many people, actually, I've worked over 20 years in industry, and almost everyone thinks they can create a survey, and it's not quite so simple. So let's look at these a step at a time, and I'll walk you through it. So step 1, selecting topics of research and then digging down or making them more specific into dimensions. Again, you should be doing this in a group setting, in a group meeting, whether it's a video meeting, a Zoom meeting, or an in-person meeting. Okay, the first thing you want to do is that, remember from assignment A1, you were told to identify some different areas that you're interested in as an individual. Maybe it's racial justice, maybe it's dieting, maybe it's wealth accumulation, maybe it's global warming. It could be any topic, really. And again, remember that we're focusing on attitudes, not data. We're not asking questions that we can figure out by looking at numbers. We're looking at people's attitudes and opinions about something and how they affect that. Okay, so be careful there. All right. So every team member should have 1 or 2 ideas. You should put them all in a hat, and then figure out some way to pick your top 3. Do multi-voting, etc. So when my team did this, for example, my hypothetical team, we came up with 3. This is your first answer to number 1, and it'll be written in exactly this way: attitudes about whatever your idea or construct is. So we came up with 3 ideas: global warming, equal pay by gender, and eating red meat. So notice how we wrote those. Attitudes, we're interested in attitudes about global warming, attitudes about gender pay, gender equal pay. We could have just wrote gender pay, pay by gender. and then attitudes about eating red meat. The second part of number 1 is for each of these ideas or constructs, you need to define 3 dimensions. And what we're going to do is we need to be more specific. And a dimension is an attribute or characteristic of the idea. So ask yourself, what are important ideas, opinions about each concept? So for example, we're going to say, what are important ideas or opinions about the concept of global warming? What's out there and what's going on? And when we did that, we came up with these 3. There's a lot of people that think global warming is a hoax. There's a lot of different opinions or attitudes about the causes of global warming, whether it's man-made or it's just a natural phenomenon that occurs, every century or 2. And then there's also attitudes and opinions, and you might think about that, attitudes and opinions about solutions to global warming. What you're seeing in yellow, is the actual answer that we'll have on number 1. So you have 2 answers so far here. You've got the first piece, which is this attitudes, this number 1, 2, 3, attitudes about global warming, gender equal pay, and red meat. And then you're going to have 9 of these dimensions. You're going to break down each of these initial constructs into more specific things. And you want to be as specific as possible here. And again, thinking about what are the important opinions. When we looked at equal pay, we thought that, people's attitudes about gender roles, traditional gender roles, could be important here and could be interesting. We also thought there's a lot of attitudes and opinions about whether this should be legislated or market driven. And then there's even attitudes about, is this even important? And so those are the 3 that we came up with to kind of focus more, to bring more focus to our research and our ideas. And as far as eating red meat, we came up with attitudes about cooking steak rare. Also, there's ideas and opinions about eating or not eating animals. And then there's also thoughts and opinions and attitudes about health impacts of red meat. So what you're seeing in the yellow and that 1, 2, 3 list on closer to the left in the top, these are our answers to part number 1. Okay. In step number 2, we're now going to narrow it down from 3 topics to 1. So now again, this is important while your group needs to be together. You need to select a topic, 1 out of those 3, and then we're going to identify related variables. And a good way to do this is to be looking at those dimensions and thinking about which of those are more clear, which of those are more interesting, etc. So pick 1 idea from those that generated. Ask yourself what is most interesting to us as a group, and be sure to be looking at those dimensions and thinking which are the most clear. If any of them are kind of vague, I'd leave that one off. Okay? If it's easy to be misinterpreted, I would pick another idea or construct. Now we're going to identify 6 different independent variables related to the idea. Remember, independent variables are these groups or classifications. This is how you put people's responses into groups. For example, the age of the person who responds, the race, the religion, where they live, their income, their education. It could be a million different things. Okay. Again, reminding you that your classmates are the ones taking the survey. This is so you get exposure to this entire process and to make it easier for us to manage it. So you need to pick independent variables that can be represented by your classmates. So you cannot, if you're really looking to do research into people who have not graduated high school, you cannot do it for this project. Okay? If you're looking for people over 80, chances are there aren't a lot of people in our class that are over 80. I could be wrong, but there's not going to be a lot. And then when you're doing this, so when I'm doing this question, our team picked eating red meat. We liked that one. It was simple, it was direct, and the simple idea can be fine and throughout this process. And then you're going to think, which group or classification, which independent variables likely affect people's opinions about eating red meat? Well, we certainly thought gender was one of them. We thought age might be as well, that younger people might be more likely to be vegetarians. The education level we thought was possible, the profession that someone worked, their religion, and income level. So you need to pick 6 of these. So you have 2 answers again for number 2. The first answer is, which of the dimensions are you going to, which of your constructs are you going to use? And that was eating red meat. And then which identifying 6 independent variables or classifications or groups that you think will affect people's attitudes about eating red meat. Okay, these are the independent variables. The dependent variable is the attitude about red meat, eating red meat. Do you get that? So this idea is our dependent variable, and we're trying to figure out how the independent variables, like for example, how do if someone being a man, how does that affect in general the attitudes about eating red meat, etc. And we're going to look at that more. So these are your 2 answers here. When we go to number 3, we're going to use the dimensions, and this is really important, not your original construct, not eating red meat, but the breakdown for that, and the independent variables to create a conceptual hypothesis. So first, remind yourself of the dimensions selected. For our group, remember we broke eating red meat into attitudes about cooking steak rare, attitudes about not eating animals, and attitudes about the health impacts of red meat. So it's important to remind you, because this is what we're going to use, and we're going to the conceptual hypothesis is almost going to look exactly like this, with one difference, and that is we're going to use the independent variables. So when you think about each of these dimensions, for example, the first one is cooking steak rare, which independent variable from your list, here's our list over here, do we think is most related to an attitudes about cooking steak rare? And for us, we thought that was gender. We thought that gender impacts attitudes about cooking meat. When we thought about attitudes about not eating animals, we thought religion would have a greater impact on that. And when we thought about the health impacts of red meat, we thought age would be that. And so these are our 3 conceptual hypotheses. Now notice that we're gonna write each of these hypotheses in the exact same way. We're gonna use the independent variable from step 2, from number 2, affects, this is the exact language, affects attitudes about, and then the dimension that we see above. So for example, this is exactly what we get. The independent variable gender affects attitudes about cooking steak rare, the dimension. The independent variable religion from our list affects attitudes about not eating animals. And our independent variable of age that we had affects attitudes about the health impacts of eating red meat. So notice here, all we've done is figured out which one we think is most likely to affect that attitude, and then written it in this format. So the yellow box at the bottom is your answer to step number 3. Step number 4, define the indicators for the independent variables used in step number 3. Now remember, we only used 3 of the 6, and the 3 that we used were gender, age, and religion. So we can cross these others out, at least mentally in our mind. So we first want to remind ourselves of the independent variables selected, and we selected gender, religion, and age. Now, when we're doing this, what we're trying to do is create a list of all the indicators, the exhaustive list of subsets of what's in a gender. How do we identify gender? How do we identify religion? How do we identify age? But specifically, we want to be thinking a little bit ahead, and what subset of the independent variable is most related to each dimension. Well, gender is pretty straightforward, okay? Remember that when we're defining these, we need to use mutually exclusive and exhaustive lists of indicators for each IV. This means all possible subsets of each independent variable. Think about what's most of interest to the idea. So for example, in gender's not necessarily a good one, but we're thinking about which different categories of gender are most related to cooking steak rare. Gender's pretty specific. But in age, that could be very different. You know, I mean, we could define ages in ranges of 5 years, 0 to 5, 6 to 10, etc. But that's a lot of answers or a lot of data to collect, and we may not need it. We may only be concerned about people over 60. And so we could define the group just in that terms, okay? And that's what you're going to see here in a minute. Okay, so when you're doing each of these, think about what part of that independent variable are we really looking to get information about. So for gender, we define gender as male, female, and other. Now, especially in today's day and age, you can't just use male and female, you've got to have more. Now, I could have put more subsets there, but often if we're only concerned about male and female, then we can use other to shorten the list. When we're talking about religion and not eating animals, there's hundreds of religions in the world, but we picked the 5 largest, and we were really concerned about one of them that we knew about. And Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and other were the languages, or excuse me, the religions that we picked. So we didn't have to list 100. And if you were only interested in one religion, you could pick, that religion and put other. But the problem with that is if later you wanted to use that same data set, you would only have information on who was in the religion that you originally wanted. So for example, maybe we want to look at Hindus for our study, and then after we do that, we realize, oh, we'd really like to look at Jewish people as well. Well, if we didn't have this indicator listed like this, then if we only had Hindu and other, then we wouldn't know who the Jewish people are. So we often make lists longer than what we really want just for our specific study, in case we need to go back and do more. And then as far as age, we did break this down very briefly as people under 40 and people 40 and over. Okay, now this is very clear. Notice this is, people get this often wrong. They would write people under 40 and people over 40. If you do that, realize it's not it's not exhaustive, because you would exclude people who are exactly 40. So that's what, you have to be careful about mutually exclusive and exhaustive indicators. So these are the 3 answers that we have for number 4, which is just the list of indicators for each of our independent variables. The last part is to create operational hypotheses using the indicators and not just the independent variables. So the first thing you want to do is remind yourself of the answers to number 3. Remember how these work. Gender affects attitudes about cooking steak rare. Religion affects attitudes about not eating animals. Age affects attitudes about health impacts of eating red meat. Then you want to remind yourself of the indicators, the independent variable indicators. This is what we just did in the last step, and we can see these here. Okay, now we want to create an operational hypothesis using these indicators. So we want to use male, female, or other instead of gender. Okay, and we're going to use a very specific and exact format. This language, the indicator, whichever one we're going to use, tends to support the dimension, cooking steak rare, more often or less often than another indicator. Okay? So for our first hypothesis, we're going to change this one from number 3 to males tend to support cooking steak rare more often than non-males. So notice we combined female and other into a category. So there might be some smithing here, and in the next one you're going to see a little bit more of that. In the second one, religion, we changed to Buddhist, tend to support the idea to not eat animals. Notice I changed this because I don't want to tend to support, it just make the wording right and make it clear to support the idea to not eat animals more often than non-Buddhists. So again, we picked one versus multiples, okay? And then the last one, for age, we changed that to people 40 and over, tend to support the idea, and notice I put this even more, we gave it direction, the idea that red meat causes health issues more often than people under 40. This one we had to do a major change, because if we just said tend to support health impacts of eating red meat, we don't know what that means. A low health impact is possible, as well as a high health impact. So notice here we really had to change the wording of our dimension to make this an operational hypothesis. People 40 and over tend to support the idea that red meat causes health issues. Okay, so we had to be a lot more specific here and change it. And so this last yellow box at the bottom is really what you're driving toward in this whole exercise, because what I'm going to do as your instructor now is tell you which of these are approved for you to move forward in the survey project, and you're going to need to pick one of them. I hope this helped, and I'm sorry it was a little bit longer than I had planned, but I hope it will make it much more clear.